Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be a new video series I'm starting. This is my very first one. I'm calling it Ask Dr. B About Music Theory. And the reason I started this is because I've gotten so many great comments from you all who've watched my lessons, my music theory lessons, and left comments, asked great questions, and I'm sure there's other people who have the exact same questions as some of those that you guys posted. So I have 3 questions I'm going to start with this week, and this comes from Trojan Virus. Thank you for scaring me just a little bit when I first read that one. Trojan Virus asks, anything in this mix about counterpoint? Well, the answer is, here it is. It's coming. Bella Jar Guitar wrote, great lecture. You are a great lecturer. Thanks for uploading these videos. You are the best. I always wait the new lecture from you, especially harmony and maybe counterpoint. But before, thank you. These videos are very helpful. Well, I appreciate it. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted these videos to be useful, to be helpful. And you asked about harmony and maybe counterpoint. Another person wanted counterpoint. Finally, William APM writes, would you consider doing something on advanced counterpoint? Not species 1 through 5, but definitely larger forms. Well, William, we're going to hold off on those larger contrapuntal forms, things like fugue. We might be getting around to covering those. But since you mentioned species counterpoint, that's where we're going to start. And the reason we're going to start there is because it is such a foundational topic of study. It's often covered in collegiate music theory programs. Some colleges do it, others do not. But it is foundational for part writing. And a lot of that information, the ideas started, I guess, really the music of Palestrina in the Renaissance. But in 1725, there was a book published, and I have that book. It was called Gradus Ad Parnnasum. It was by Fuchs. And this book is written, and this is a translation in English, and it covers species counterpoint. So species counterpoint had 5 different species, and we're going to cover first species right now, and we're only going to do part of first species because this is a pretty complicated subject. So this is first species. It's called note against note. And let me start giving you some of that information. So the idea is you have a cantus firmus. Now a cantus firmus was something that was used throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And the idea was this was a melody that was used as a foundation for adding other melodies and counterpoint on top or below. Often it was a Gregorian chant that then would be used and expanded upon to make 2-voice, 3-voice, 4-voice, 5-voice contrapuntal structures. So for our purposes, this cantus firmus is what we're given. And what we're going to do is write note against note, first species counterpoint, and we're going to do that first species above the cantus firmus. You can also do it below the cantus firmus. It has very similar rules, but there are a few exceptions. But right now we're just going to focus on writing above. To that end, in note against note, first species, you're only going to use consonances. We only use consonances. So let's review what are consonances. Well, there are perfect consonances and imperfect consonances. So a perfect consonance is your unison, 1, your 5th, and your octave, or the 8. Your imperfect consonances are your 3rds and 6ths. So we're only going to use 1, 3, 5, 6, and 8. So no seconds, no 4ths, no 7ths. Only consonances. Now, there's still more to be considered. We're going to use more imperfect consonances than perfect consonances. So then when we're all done writing our counterpoint above this cantus firmus, there should be more 3rds and 6ths than 1, 5s, or 8s. We will begin, you are allowed to begin when you're writing a species counterpoint above a cantus firmus on either the unison, the 5th, or the octave. You have that choice. The unison can only be used at the very beginning and at the very end. You can't write a unison in the middle. So you don't have to start with a unison. You don't have to use it at those beginning or ending points, but you can't use it in the middle. So that's another rule to keep in mind. Then the penultimate measure must be a sixth, or the enharmonic equivalent, which would be a minor third. So we're writing species counterpoint. I'm going to write that in right now. So our penultimate measure means second to last. So penultimate measure right here, we have a pitch. It is a D. That means I need a sixth. I'm going to write that in right now so I don't forget that letter is a B. Now, knowing that I need to end on a perfect consonance, I know I'm going to have to end on this C. So that's the other thing. You're almost always going to end on a, well, not almost always, you always will end on a perfect consonance. And in this case, when you have this B, you're almost always either going, if it's a B below, it'll go to the C unison. If it's a B above, it will go to the octave. So again, rule 5, penultimate measure must be a sixth or its inversion. Now, some of the rules, and I want to go over this before we start trying to write our counterpoint, is the melodic movement, because this is what's so important. You're not allowed to use any augmented, diminished, or chromatic intervals. So first off, it's going to be entirely diatonic, but we're going to make sure not to have any augmented or diminished intervals. Now, where would you find diminished intervals if you're going diatonically? Well, you have the tritone. When we deal with species counterpoint, it was often done in a modal context. So what we're using right now is cantus firmus based in C. So for those of you familiar with major minor tonality, this is going to be like a C major scale. But this was an Ionian mode. And we could talk about, and very often when you do species counterpoint, you'll do a cantus firmus based on A, which would be Aeolian, or D, which would be Dorian, or E, which would be Phrygian, or F, which would be Lydian, or G, which would be Mixolydian. Those aren't important for you to necessarily memorize right now. I just want you to be aware that depending on what mode your cantus firmus is in, you'll have to be aware of where you might find augmented or diminished intervals. And you can't use chromatic alteration. That tritone, which is the kind of biggest culprit of where things can go wrong for you, you can't even outline it when you're writing your counterpuntal line. Which would mean like you couldn't say start on an F, go up to a B, and then come back down to an F, because F to B in that one direction would outline a tritone. So in this case, F to B would be an augmented fourth. So you have to be very careful on where you change direction in your contrapuntal line, such that the peaks and the valleys don't emphasize the tritone. That interval is too dissonant to the ear. It makes it stand out in a way that's a bit jarring. Now, if you're going for something that's jarring, by all means, write a tritone. But that's not the base for contrapuntal writing. Your base is usually something that flows and is smooth, so you don't want the jarring effect of the tritone. Our next aspect of melodic movement, we don't want to have any leaps larger than a perfect fifth. No leaps larger than a perfect fifth. There's two exceptions. One is you can jump the octave, and the other is the ascending, which means going up, jumping up, ascending minor sixth. Those intervals will work. One of the reasons it's so great to work on species counterpoint is because as you try to do this, and I urge you to play this at the piano, at the keyboard, to hear what it sounds like. You'll hear, when you do it following these rules, how everything just flows and sounds rich and full, and your ear starts to become really sensitive to the finer aspects of harmony and melody. And it's kind of like, you know, if you don't have that experience, you sometimes can't tell the difference between those subtleties that really become apparent when you work on species counterpoint. Our next melodic movement rule is that you can only repeat a note once, which means that you're writing your counterpuntal line and it should be in motion. It should be moving up by step, down by step, a leap up or down. It can repeat, but it should only do once. In other words, you can't just go C, 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 a bunch of C's in a row. It would be boring, it wouldn't be a melody. Even though you can repeat a note once, you don't want to have too many repeated notes. Even if you start moving and then you repeat again, you don't want to do that too many times. Maybe 2 times max when you're writing a short excerpt like what we're doing right here. If you do have a leap or a skip of a fourth or more, you want to step back in the opposite direction right away. So if you jump up from C to G, your next note should probably be an F back in the other direction. So skips must be filled in by stepping backwards. You can jump a third and then another third in the same direction. The third is an interesting interval. It sometimes functions like a leap, but sometimes it functions like a step. Because it kind of outlines a triad and it's a smaller leap, it has that flexibility. So you can leap 2/3 in a row in the same direction. You don't have to step back. But if you leap a fourth or more, you definitely need to step back. Then, finally, if you're going to move into a harmonic unison or octave, you can't skip into it. You can't jump into that. That has to be done by stepwise motion. Because the octave and the unison are so consonant, they're so grounding, you want to be a lot smoother to keep that flow going. And if you make a leap, it further emphasizes that grounding consonance. Then finally, voice crossing is allowed. Now this is not the case when we do 4-part traditional writing, Bach chorale style writing, but for these purposes, for species counterpoint, you are allowed to cross voices for voice leading purposes. So the next thing we have to talk about, and I mentioned it briefly here, is the different kinds of motion. Okay, we have direct motion. So direct motion is where both voices move in the same direction, whether that is up or down. Now, when we deal with 4-part writing, we usually break direct motion into 2 categories. One is similar motion, which means where it goes in the same direction but by different intervals, and the other is parallel motion. So we splinter that category, but back here, back 1725, we just really talked about direct motion. And the rule is you can't have direct motion into a perfect consonance. Now this is tricky. This is hard because you can, under certain circumstances in 4-part writing, have similar motion into a perfect consonance. You'll remember that you can't have parallel motion into a parallel fifths or parallel octaves, but here it's even more restrictive. You cannot have direct motion, which would be similar and parallel, into a perfect consonance. You have contrary motion, and contrary motion is great. Any contrary motion is acceptable. Oblique, any oblique motion. So contrary motion is where one voice goes up and the other goes down, or vice versa. Top voice goes down, bottom voice goes up. Oblique motion is where one voice stays the same and the other voice moves up or down. So with that, with all those rules, we're going to see if we can come up with our first species counterpoint. I recommend, for those of you who have a piece of staff paper at home, you might want to write down this cantus firmus. We start on a C, E, F, G, E, A, G, E, F, E, D, C. So 12 measures. I would recommend you write that out if you have access to the pen and paper. And we're going to write something above. And so there's more than one solution to this. I'm just going to give you one, and so by writing this down, you can try your hand and see if you can come up with some other options that work, that follow all these rules, that sounds great when you get done. So, step one, I can begin with either a unison, a fifth, or an octave. Well, I just look at this one and I see that it starts by going up. So I don't want to go with a unison. I'm going to try to avoid voice crossing, even though it's allowed. I'm going to try to avoid it. So since this cantus firmus starts by going up, I want to have a little room, so I could either start on the G, the fifth, or the C. I'm just going to pick the C. So I'm going to pick the C. So we start with an octave. And what I recommend doing is that you write the interval, harmonic interval between your cantus firmus and your note, just so you're keeping track of stuff. So this is an octave, so I write an 8 right here in between the two staves. I then move up to an E. Well, I know contrary motion, I can't go wrong. So let me see if I can come up with something. If I go here and I just, let's say, go down a step, I then go into a fifth. Well, is that okay? Well, the only thing I really have to be careful of with a fifth is that I don't move in direct motion into the fifth. And this is actually contrary. So going to the B, so I have CC, octave, going to EB, a fifth, approached by contrary motion. I'm fine. I'm doing great. Well, now in the cantus it moves up to an F. What if I continue down the scale here? C, B, and I go to an A. Because I do want more imperfect consonances, and I just had 2 perfect consonances in a row. So this is a great opportunity. I have in the third measure an F to an A. That is a third. There's my imperfect consonants. Wonderful. Well, at this point, I could go down to the G and then have another octave, or actually I would have a unison, but I can't. Rule 4, I don't want a unison, only maybe at the beginning and the end. So at this point, I don't want to do that. I could do some voice crossing and make a leap down to maybe an E. But in this case, I'm going to move with direct motion. I'm going to have FA move to GB, which would be parallel thirds. And parallel thirds sound great. So I'm going to do that. In my next measure here, I have an E in the cantus firmus. So, in the spirit of keeping some contrary motion and having as many thirds and sixes as possible, if I say, well, what would be a third and sixth? Well, a G or a C. I don't want to have 3 thirds in a row. It would be too much the same. I want to have some independence in my different melodic lines. So to do that, I can just keep going up the scale here, and I'll get my sixth. Let me say that part again, because that's important. You don't want to have too many of the same interval in a row. Even though parallel thirds sound great, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, it's going to get boring. You want to have some more independence of melodic line with your counterpoint that you're adding. Now here, my next measure, I have an A in my cantus firmus. And again, I'm looking to have as many thirds and sixes. So if I just think about, well, what would be the third and sixth? Well, the third would be a C, and the sixth would be an F. I could keep the C like a common tone. I'm allowed to repeat notes, as it says in Rule 6D here, but I don't want to do it too much. So, but I'm halfway through and I haven't done it yet. That's an option. Or I could go to an F. I could jump down to the F, I could jump up to the F, but then I'm kind of maintaining that same interval. It would be another 6 in a row. And I'd rather have a little bit more independence of melodic line and vary the intervals. So for me, I'm going to repeat the C. So then I have the interval of a third, A to C. My next note is a G in the cantus. Here, I now have 4 thirds imperfect consonances and 2 perfect consonances. So here's a great opportunity to go and use my perfect consonants again, because I can use contrary motion, AC, can go to G, D. And there I have a fifth. And I double check myself. I say, did I use direct motion to get into that fifth? I did not. I used contrary motion. And you just can't go wrong with contrary motion. So you'll see that from the beginning we had contrary motion, direct, contrary, oblique, contrary. So we've used all three of the different types of motion that can be used. Again, what that does is it really establishes two independent melodic lines. And historically, what this is coming from is this would have been sung by a bunch of monks, this cantus firmus. And you might have another bunch of monks that would sing this line, note against note, counterpoint, to the cantus firmus. And you'd have these harmonies. And so this is really in the spirit of where this music comes from. We then get to our next note in the cantus firmus, which is an E. Now, one thing that I haven't talked about yet, but is actually really important and to a certain extent deserves its entire own video, is that when you're writing a cantus firmus, you usually want to have a climax, a high point. Now you can have a climax being the highest note in your cantus firmus or the lowest note in your cantus firmus. So if we look at our cantus firmus, C, E, F, G, E, jump up to the A. That A is the highest note in our cantus firmus. And it is further emphasized by leaping into that. So right there, that's our climax of our cantus firmus. There should only be one when you're writing a cantus firmus, if you were to write one yourself. I'm going to try to keep that same spirit when I'm writing my contrapuntal line. So I would like to have a high point in my contrapuntal line. And this is a great opportunity right here to keep stepping up to the E. And I'll make my E the highest note in my counterpoint. And that makes it an octave into octaves. I approached it with contrary motion, so I know I'm okay. Now, our next note is an F. Here, I'm going to want to leap. Because if you'll notice, I've just been going up and down the scale. C, D, A, B, C, C, D, E. Too much scale can get boring. You want to have a leap or two whenever possible. So I'm going to make a dramatic leap. I'm going to leap down a fifth. So a fifth is the largest leap I can make. If you remember back, you can leap down an octave. You can do an ascending minor six. But for most purposes, the fifth is going to be the biggest leap you make. So I do that, and I leap into a third, which again, I want more imperfect consonances. I just had two perfect consonances in a row, so it's time to mix it up. Try to give us that variety. So here, after I've done that leap, I need to follow the other rule, which is after I make a leap of a fourth or more, I need to step back. So a step back would be a B, which creates a fifth with the E in the cantus. I'm going to repeat that B, because that's what I had to do. If you remember from all the way back, we know that the penultimate measure must be a sixth. So we have that repeated note again, that creates our sixth, and resolves to our octave. So what that will mean is we have perfect consonances, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 perfect consonances, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 imperfect consonances. Yeah, we want more imperfect consonances than perfect, so that's not quite ideal, but it's acceptable. It works, and it works in part because they're mixed in there with the perfect consonances. It's not a bunch of perfect consonances in a row. We only have at most 2 perfect consonances in a row. So, as I said before, what you always want to do is start to train your ear along to combine it with your theory. You want to connect your ear with your theory. So you should play this on a piano or put it into a computer program and have it play it for you. Just a bunch of whole notes, note against notes, first species, cantus firmus in the lower voice, the counterpoint in the upper voice. So I'm going to go over and I'm going to play this for you. I'm going to start by playing the cantus alone. So if you take a listen, this is the cantus alone. Here we go. Now with our counterpoint above. And that works. That really works. It has all the qualities we were looking for. It has independence. It's an independent melodic line. It sounds like a melody. So, do, ti, la, ti, do, do, re, mi, la, ti, ti, do. It works harmonically with this. It sounds good. If you had this, two people singing it, it would sound great. If you had two instruments playing it, let's say two different saxophones or two clarinets, this would work beautifully. Everyone would enjoy it. It follows all of our rules. I urge you to go take this cantus firmus, see if you can come up with some other options, other counterpoints. Start with the fifth, do some voice crossing, and just see what you can do in terms of developing this. And again, who knows, you might see this on some kind of examination, because some colleges, some conservatories like to go back to this foundational music theory information that came out of the music of the Renaissance, of Palestrina, and was very common in the Baroque era, and gives you a good example of what to expect if anyone asks you about species counterpoint. Thanks so much.